Dana White once called Chuck Liddell washed up and tried to force him into retirement. 3 months later, Chuck's comeback fight broke every pay-per-view record the UFC had ever set. The UFC has always sold a powerful idea. No fighter is bigger than the brand. Champions come and go, belts change hands, and the machine keeps moving. It's a message repeated so often that fans begin to accept it as truth. But every once in a while, the UFC tests that belief and loses spectacularly. Because while fights can be booked and champions can be crowned, some fighters are not just athletes. They are moments. They are eras. And when the UFC tries to replace them too quickly, too forcefully, the cracks in their corporate mythology begin to show. This pattern usually starts the same way. A dominant star becomes expensive, outspoken, injured, or difficult to control. Negotiations sour, public narratives shift. Suddenly, a new name is pushed forward. A next version, a better model, someone younger, cheaper, easier to manage. On paper, it makes perfect business sense. In reality, fans don't connect to replacements the way promotions desperately expect them to. Chuck Liddell was the first major test of this theory, and the UFC failed miserably. When Chuck Liddell's knockout power began to fade in the late 2000s, Dana White and the Fertitta brothers saw an aging star whose best days were behind him. They had newer, younger light heavyweights ready to take his place. Fighters like Rashad Evans, Quinton Jackson, and Forrest Griffin were supposed to be the future, more marketable, more controllable, more profitable. But here's what the UFC brass fundamentally misunderstood. Chuck Liddell wasn't just winning fights, he was embodying a moment when the UFC itself was becoming mainstream. His mohawk, his knockout power, and his stone-cold demeanor had transcended the sport. When Liddell fought, casual fans tuned in. When he knocked someone out with those sledgehammer hands, highlight reels were born that played on SportsCenter and late-night talk shows. The UFC didn't just let time move naturally, they rushed the transition. They pushed other fighters harder, gave them better promotional packages, and even encouraged Liddell to retire gracefully. But every time they tried to crown a new face of the UFC, the numbers told a devastating story. Pay-per-view buy rates dropped, mainstream media attention waned, the casual fan base that Chuck had built simply wasn't transferring to his supposed replacements. This was the UFC's first hard lesson. Fighters can be marketed, but loyalty can't be manufactured. When fans invest in someone's journey, replacement feels forced, artificial, disrespectful. The promotion tried everything to replicate Liddell's success with similar fighters. They brought in strikers, promoted their knockout power, and tried to manufacture that same lightning-in-a-bottle appeal. None of it worked. Chuck's combination of personality, fighting style, and perfect timing in the sport's growth couldn't be replicated or replaced. The danger wasn't just losing one star, it was losing trust. Fans noticed when narratives were manipulated, when Chuck's legacy was minimized, when his exit was rewritten to favor newer, more convenient storylines. And in trying to move on too fast, the UFC accidentally amplified the very legend they wanted to replace. What made Chuck's situation especially powerful was what happened after the attempted replacement failed. The fighter who was supposed to fade away became bigger in absence. His highlights were replayed endlessly. His interviews were revisited. His impact became clearer with distance. Even today, nearly 2 decades later, Chuck Liddell remains one of the most recognizable faces in MMA history. This is not about bitterness or blame. It's about understanding power. Fighters are not interchangeable parts. Some represent turning points in the sport's history. Chuck Liddell proved that when you become synonymous with the sport itself, you transcend typical business calculations. You become more than an employee. You become essential to the brand's identity in ways that can't be measured on a spreadsheet. The Iceman's story became the template for understanding what the UFC would learn the hard way over and over again. Some fighters simply cannot be replaced, no matter what the front office wants. This lesson would repeat itself many times over the following decades, creating a pattern so undeniable that it exposed the fundamental limits of corporate control in combat sports. If this already sounds familiar, stay with us. These stories repeat for a reason, and the deeper we go, the clearer the pattern becomes.
Dana White once called Tito Ortiz the biggest pain in the ass I've ever worked with. He didn't say it privately, he said it publicly, repeatedly. And eventually, Tito Ortiz wasn't just criticized, he was erased. Banned from UFC events, frozen out of promotional material, treated like a problem the company needed to forget. But the UFC didn't just lose Tito Ortiz, they underestimated him. Before Conor McGregor turned trash talk into an art form, before social media gave fighters microphones, there was Tito Ortiz, raw, emotional, and completely uncontrollable. The Huntington Beach bad boy wasn't polished, he wasn't media trained, he didn't follow scripts, and that terrified the UFC as it tried to reinvent itself as a mainstream sports brand in the mid-2000s. Tito represented the old UFC, chaotic, emotional, unpredictable. The promotion wanted a new image, fighters who showed up, fought, and disappeared quietly back into the system. Tito wanted to be seen, he wanted to speak, he wanted to feel bigger than the cage. So the UFC made a decision that seemed logical on paper: replace him. They leaned into Chuck Liddell as the face of violence without controversy. They promoted Rich Franklin as the clean-cut champion, Matt Hughes as the disciplined professional. These were reliable fighters, corporate-friendly, easy to manage. The UFC believed fans would move on naturally. They were wrong. What the UFC failed to understand was that Tito Ortiz wasn't just a fighter, he was a connection. Fans didn't tune in just to see him win, they tuned in to feel something. His trash talk wasn't rehearsed, his emotions weren't controlled. When he lost, he broke down. When he won, he celebrated like a villain. And when he made mistakes, they felt human. The UFC tried to manufacture replacements, carefully approved personalities, safe bad boys. But none of them felt real. The fire was missing, the chaos was gone, and fans noticed immediately. Here's the part the UFC couldn't ignore. Even as Tito's skills declined, his drawing power didn't. His fights with Chuck Liddell and Ken Shamrock still pulled massive pay-per-view numbers. Events headlined by technically superior fighters couldn't touch them. Tito was proof that star power doesn't always follow wins, it follows emotion. So when the UFC finally let him walk, they expected relief. Instead, they watched their competitors cash in. Bellator offered Tito money the UFC never would, and even past his prime, he delivered. Ratings spiked, mainstream attention followed. His retirement fight generated more buzz than most active UFC champions ever managed. That was the moment the UFC realized their mistake. They hadn't replaced Tito Ortiz. They had proven they couldn't. Because authenticity, messy, emotional, unpredictable authenticity, can't be engineered. And once fans connect to it, taking it away only makes it more valuable. And if you think Tito Ortiz was the last time the UFC misjudged star power, that pattern only gets worse from here.
The UFC learned a painful lesson with Tito Ortiz. They discovered that you can remove a fighter from the roster, but you can't erase what fans emotionally attach to. Star power doesn't transfer. Authenticity doesn't clone. And once the machine loses someone who connects beyond wins and losses, the void becomes obvious. But instead of accepting that truth, the UFC doubled down on the same mistake. They convinced themselves that Tito Ortiz was an exception, a relic of a chaotic era, a problem child they'd simply outgrown. The next superstar, they believed, would be easier to manage, more professional, more controllable. Then, Brock Lesnar walked through the door.
The UFC didn't just underestimate Brock Lesnar, they openly mocked the idea of him. When Brock Lesnar entered the UFC in 2008, the reaction from hardcore MMA fans was immediate and vicious. This wasn't a real fighter, they said. This was a WWE attraction, a walking publicity stunt brought in to cash checks and embarrass a sport that was still fighting for legitimacy. Even inside the UFC, executives treated Lesnar like an experiment, not a long-term investment. He was useful for headlines, not history. Then, Brock Lesnar shattered the illusion. He didn't slowly learn the game. He didn't need a decade of seasoning. In just his fourth professional MMA fight, Brock Lesnar became UFC heavyweight champion. The speed of his rise stunned purists, but the business impact shocked everyone. UFC 100, headlined by Lesnar versus Frank Mir, didn't just sell well, it obliterated expectations. over 1.6 million pay-per-view buys, a number so massive it redefined what success even meant in combat sports. Suddenly, Brock Lesnar wasn't a novelty, he was the business. But success created a problem the UFC hates more than failure. Brock Lesnar was uncontrollable. He didn't think like an employee, he thought like leverage. His WWE background taught him that stars negotiate from power, not gratitude. He demanded massive paydays, special treatment, and flexible schedules. And worst of all, for the UFC's philosophy, Brock Lesnar knew exactly how valuable he was. For a promotion built on the belief that no fighter is bigger than the brand, Brock Lesnar was corporate poison. When diverticulitis forced him into retirement in 2011, UFC leadership quietly felt relief. The headache was gone, the leverage disappeared, and in their minds, this was a chance to reset the heavyweight division with champions who were easier to manage, easier to replace, and easier to control. They immediately went shopping for the next Brock Lesnar. Former NFL players were signed, Olympic wrestlers were promoted, massive heavyweights with clean personalities were positioned as the future. Shane Carwin had terrifying knockout power. Cain Velasquez had elite skill and a marketable backstory. Junior Dos Santos had speed, charisma, and finishing ability. On paper, the division looked stronger than ever. In reality, the audience didn't follow. Pay-per-view numbers dropped, mainstream attention faded. Heavyweight title fights became events for hardcore fans, not cultural moments. The division that once carried the UFC's biggest cards now struggled to pull casual viewers. The fights were better, the fighters were more complete, but something was missing. Brock Lesnar had brought an audience the UFC didn't know how to replace. WWE fans, casual sports fans, media outlets that never covered MMA. Brock Lesnar didn't just headline fights, he dragged entire new demographics into the sport. His presence turned UFC cards into spectacles. You didn't have to understand MMA to care about Brock Lesnar, you just had to recognize him. That reality became impossible to ignore when the UFC started chasing him again. Years after his retirement, the promotion began negotiating with WWE, offering Brock Lesnar contracts that shattered their own pay structure. Rules that applied to every other fighter suddenly bent. Drug testing protocols were adjusted, exceptions were made. When Brock Lesnar returned at UFC 200 to face Mark Hunt, the result was predictable. The event exploded commercially, one of the highest-selling pay-per-views in company history, all for a fighter they once treated as expendable. The message was brutal and undeniable. The UFC didn't replace Brock Lesnar, they never came close. Even years removed from full-time competition, Brock Lesnar could outdraw active champions in their primes. His absence exposed a truth the UFC prefers not to admit. Star power is rare. Authentic crossover appeal can't be engineered. And sometimes the fighter who breaks every rule is the one holding the entire business together. Brock Lesnar forced the UFC to evolve, not through obedience, but through disruption. The promotion that once viewed him as a temporary stunt eventually reshaped its entire strategy around finding the next crossover phenomenon. But the irony remains, they're still looking. And that search proves the most uncomfortable lesson of all. Some fighters aren't replaceable, they're events.
Tito Ortiz taught the UFC that authenticity couldn't be manufactured. Brock Lesnar taught them that star power couldn't be controlled. Both men shattered the same illusion that the UFC could simply replace fighters who outgrew the machine. So when the promotion believed it had finally learned its lesson, when it thought it had found the perfect balance between personality and obedience, between spectacle and structure, it didn't come from wrestling or rebellion. It came from Ireland. And this time, the fighter didn't just resist replacement. He broke the system so completely that the UFC has been trying to rebuild around his absence ever since. The UFC didn't create Conor McGregor, they discovered him, and then spent the next decade trying to survive him. When McGregor arrived, the promotion believed it had finally found the ideal star, charismatic but coachable, loud but marketable, confident but controllable. He spoke in sound bites, sold fights effortlessly, and delivered knockouts that matched the hype. At first, Conor looked like the UFC's greatest success story. but very quick attention. Press conferences stopped being about
So now,
matchups
as long
and
as you
became
show up
about
for them,
him.
maybe if you showed up
Other
for them,
fighters
you'll
didn't
get a
just
little
share
film
cards
in.
with Conor,
Yeah,
they
well,
disappeared
well,
behind him.
take him
Entire
up.
divisions stalled because no one wanted to move without McGregor attached. The UFC loved the money. They feared the leverage. Conor McGregor became the first fighter in company history to flip the power dynamic. He didn't need the UFC schedule. He dictated it. He didn't wait for title shots. He announced them. When he wanted to fight Nate Diaz, the UFC followed. When he wanted Eddie Alvarez in Madison Square Garden, the UFC built the card around him. Then came the moment that changed everything. McGregor didn't just leave the UFC, he conquered another sport. The Floyd Mayweather boxing match didn't just make money, it rewired fighter expectations forever. Conor became richer than the promotion that once controlled him. For the first time, the UFC had a star who didn't need them financially, culturally, or emotionally. That terrified them, because once Conor proved it was possible, every fighter began asking the same question: why not me? The UFC's response was subtle but aggressive. Strip titles, create interim belts, keep divisions moving without him, promote new stars as the future. But none of it worked. No matter how long McGregor stayed away, no matter how many champions rotated through divisions, nothing replaced the void he left behind. Pay-per-view numbers told the truth the promotion wouldn't say out loud. Events without Conor struggled to cross thresholds he shattered routinely. Fighters with better records couldn't move tickets. Champions with cleaner resumes couldn't command headlines. The UFC tried everything. They pushed Khabib Nurmagomedov as dominance over personality. They elevated Israel Adesanya as charisma with compliance. They marketed rising stars as the next Conor, a phrase that instantly exposed the problem. If someone is the next version of something else, they are already second. Even Conor's losses didn't diminish him, they humanized him. Every setback became a chapter instead of an ending. The bus incident, the courtroom appearances, the leg break, each moment that should have erased him only made him more culturally relevant. And the UFC hated how much they needed him, because Conor McGregor didn't just sell fights, he sold identity. Fans didn't just watch him, they aligned with him. Love or hate, they chose sides. And that emotional investment is something promotions cannot engineer on command. The most telling sign that Conor is irreplaceable isn't his success, it's the UFC's silence when he's gone. The energy shifts, the urgency disappears, the machine keeps running, but the electricity is gone. Today, the UFC promotes deeper rosters and more frequent events than ever before. Fighters are more skilled, training is more advanced, the sport is objectively better. And yet, the absence of Conor McGregor still defines the ceiling. Because the UFC didn't just fail to replace him, they built an entire era trying, and quietly accepted that some fighters don't get replaced. They get remembered.